is the Chewing the Cud podcast, a podcast for the UK dairy industry, brought to you from the southwest of England and listened to around the world. Hello, my name's Andrew Jones and welcome to Chewing the Cud podcast. And like the last couple of episodes, I'm on my own again. This is our last episode for 2024, and so Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you all, and I hope you get to spend time with your friends and family over the coming weeks. So this is our last episode for 2024, and like usual, we try and make our episode before Christmas just that little bit more relaxed, that little bit more easygoing, and not too technical, as we've done in the past when we had Greg Reid out talking about his journey to being an auctioneer, and my old neighbour James Garrity from far north Queensland talking about dairying in the tropical part of Australia. So this time we've got a former Member of Parliament who's not just an active farmer, not just a former MP, but has now recently got into podcasting. So let's sit back and enjoy. And I should say, Jeremy and Caleb, if you're ever listening to this, we'd love to have you on the podcast sometime. Maybe this time next year you'd like to come on. But anyway, as I said, let's sit back and enjoy our podcast on farming, politics and podcasting. Hello and welcome to the Chewing the Cud podcast, a podcast for the UK dairy industry. Farmer, advisor, processor and everyone else, we have topics and episodes that will interest you. We discuss the practical and the technical aspects of different UK dairy industry topics. We aim to make you think about what you're doing and ask yourself, can it be done differently? Listen to us speak with specialists from inside and outside the industry about their area of expertise. Subscribe and listen to episodes for free on your favourite podcast platform or sign up on our website www.chewingthecud.com for podcast notifications so you never miss an episode and links to our socials, or email us direct on podcast@chewingthecud.com. If you like what we do, please share and leave us a review to show your support, and that's it. Enjoy today's episode. And hello and welcome back. And today's podcast, we are going to talk about farming, politics and podcasting with our guest today, Neil Parish, former MEP and MP and current farmer here just outside Bridgewater. Good day to you, Neil.
Yeah, really lovely to join in your podcast. It'll be interesting to see what we have to say.
Well, yeah. It will. Thank you very much. So first thing I should say is this is going to be our Christmas episode. So happy Christmas to everybody, if I forget to say it later on. And I hope you all have a good Christmas and get to spend time with your friends and family. So Neil, as we usually do, let's talk a little bit about your background. So you're on, I'm guessing, a family farm here and you're still actively farming. When we met you, you were, should we say, wearing the colours of a farmer? I'm trying to put that politely, but that's fine because you're doing your job.
Made us feel at home.
Just been moving some cattle, and shall we say, a little bit of muck came with them. And,
fantastic.
I was letting them out, and I got a bit covered, but they were enjoying the field and tearing around the field. So I'm very glad I didn't try and hunt them down there, because I think this podcast we're doing very late.
Well, it is what it is. So yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself. I'm guessing this is the home farm, but yeah, what do you do here? A little bit about your background in the farming side of things.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm very much for sort of third, fourth generation farmer. Grandfather bought this place in 1920. And then my father had to sort of rebuy it because he was one of sort of 7 children, so it was quite. We'd spent a sort of long time paying off NatWest Bank what we owed them, which was an interesting time. But I left school at 16. I was milking cows at 13, and sort of.
So it was a dairy farm here originally.
Yeah, it was a dairy farm. I loved farming, and then I got into Young Farmers and started sort of spouting and liking the sound of my own voice, which is always dangerous. And then went on to the NFU, but I was only 24, 25. Far too young to have a view. So then I was approached to stand for local politics and went for district and county. Same time farming all the time. So led a very busy life. Dairy farming. Then we had sheep, beef.
Who ran the farm while you were certainly later in your politics life, in terms of being over in Europe? I know we haven't quite got there, but was that still yourself with family?
No,
or
I did have the farm let for about 12 years
Right.
in that period, but I took it back again in about 2016,
Right.
and have been running it now again for about 8 years. I suppose I farmed from sort of 16 up until about 43, 44,
Yep.
and then had a gap in between, and then came back to it, really.
Right. And what breed were you guys milking?
Milking, first of all, Guernseys and,
Wow.
and Jerseys, Channel Islands. So
Yeah.
I mean, years ago, we used to have the milk churns, and we used to leave the milk churns overnight.
Yes.
And then take the top of the milk off.
Yeah.
We
Oh,
must have
beautiful.
been eating neat cholesterol, I would think. but it was lovely, and of course. Because everybody thinks the sort of creamy colour of the milk is the cream, but of course it's the carotene
Yes,
in the
that's
milk
right.
that
Yeah.
makes it actually creamy. And then I converted to Friesians, much to my father's consternation. And then we went sort of out of dairying and into sheep. And,
when
and
did you get
arable
out of dairy?
In 1980, and then came back again in 89, because by then the bank manager was sort of,
So you got out
barking
before
at the door.
You got out before quotas came in.
We were. I mean, this is a story in itself. We were Sloan quota. This was the people who went out under a scheme
Yep.
for 5 years,
Yep.
and they introduced quota in the meantime.
Right.
And we got our quota back. And of course, it was never going to be saleable. And I thought, well, we'll get it back and we'll see.
Yeah.
And by the time I got to 1999, I sold it. And then
so you weren't- you weren't-
European Parliament at that stage.
Yeah, so you weren't one of those that got out because a lot got out, wasn't there? Was it 83, 84? That's quotas, wasn't it? 83?
Yeah, they closed
Golden
it, yeah.
handshake
That's right,
and-
golden handshakes, and but I mean, we had sort of. We just found it difficult without the dairying because, like I said, we had a big mortgage and nothing else paid the,
In the same way.
monthly fees,
Right.
really.
Yep.
And so went back in for another 10 years, enjoyed the cows.
What did you have then?
Friesians.
And then
Friesians
Friesians.
And,
Yeah.
and like I said, we used to keep a lot of calves, rear our own heifers, and had some beef. And like I said, I had sheep for 12 years. You see, my father was a sheep man, and I said, you don't get more than that for murder, do you? so I couldn't cope with them because they were always eating the grass that the cows wanted.
Yes.
They were always on their back or they were
That's
dead.
right. Yeah.
Wow.
And much as I do love to see sheep, and I love to see some nice lambs and ewes and lambs, but
Yeah.
I'd much prefer them to be other people's sheep.
Well,
Yeah, yeah.
I remember when I was at college, friends that had sheep just used to call them woolly lemmings.
That's right. They're not. You get some that are brighter than others, but they start from a very low bar.
Yeah. No, you really do.
That's
Yeah.
right, yeah.
So, how many cows did you used to have here?
We've had 80.
80. Yeah.
And I was in New Zealand once, and I put on a cow on a carousel.
Yep.
And that had 80. In one roundabout, basically one carousel, and it had 80 cows on it. And I did say to them, yes, that would have my whole herd could have gone on once.
Yeah, that's right. You finished in half an hour.
As I was chairing this joint EU New Zealand Australia committee, and of course they were quite intrigued that I could milk a cow, but of course I had milked quite a few cows in my time, so
Yes.
so the New Zealanders were quite impressed with that. Yeah.
That's a very good way to speak to New Zealanders
Well,
about cows. Yeah.
But it helps, doesn't it? Given the jobs that you then later did, you have the background to back that up in a way that some don't.
That's right. You have the practicalities of
Yes.
it. Later on when I was because when I was chairing the select committee, you're a scrutineer of government, and I would say to the ministers, it's not going to work because the farmers aren't going to accept it. It's very complicated, and if you don't really get it accepted, why are they going to do it? And I think when you've got so much practical hard work to do, sometimes they do say that business thrives despite government, not because of it. And I rather think we do, especially this one. But I wouldn't get political, would I?
No. But I mean,
Not at all.
I was going to say, as an example of that. Now, I apologise if it wasn't him. Was it Malcolm Rifkin became Minister of Defence, wasn't it? And he was the first one that never actually been in the forces himself, wasn't it? Or something.
Right, yeah.
And they gave him a lot of grief. And it's a similar vein, really, just another example of the same thing, isn't it?
Yeah, you sort of move ministers and secretaries of state around like sort of chessboard pieces, really.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes what happens is when the Prime Minister of the day has sort of moved all the pieces, he's got a few pieces left.
What do
He
we do
doesn't
with them?
quite know what to do with them. You know? And we better not chuck them out the cabinet because they'll be a pain and give me grief. You know, about the tent and which side of the tent you should be in. I won't give the whole saying. It's a family podcast. And so you know, that's the trouble. And I think sometimes people either, you know, miss out on a good job or they just get moved somewhere which is, you know, totally alien to them.
So I'm guessing going back then, you got out the cows again when you ended up in European.
Yes.
So what made you choose to go for the role of European, also MEPs? The word.
My first parliamentary seat I fought in '97 was Pontypool and Cwmbran,
right,
which is a very safe Labour mining seat in South Wales, and so and by then I was sort of getting into my early 40s, so I thought, well, I got to get on. I'd done a lot of local government for sort of 12 years, and so I was quite experienced in politics and business, but I thought I'm beginning to get long in the tooth, and so or longer in the tooth, and you see all these little young upstarts coming along, and you think, my God, I better get a move on. And so then Blair, when he came in, he, instead of having individual constituencies, you had sort of 7 for the Southwest, and you had 4 or 5 for Wales. So I thought, well, if after sort of losing the seat by a mere 24,500 votes, and didn't go there again, but I...
Not that you remember these things.
I did win Honiton, Tiverton and Honiton by 24,500 votes in 2019, so it took me a long time to repay the compliment, not in the same seat. But seriously, I sort of then went on to say, right, okay, fought this no-hope seat. Blair's changed the system. If I get on the list, each party had to put up the total number of candidates that are elected, so 7, and so the Tories were likely to get 3. I managed to get the 4th position in the Southwest. I was famous for being asked the question, how many languages do you speak? And I paused for a moment and I said, I speak Somerset and I speak English. and of course, they, having sat there all day for, you know, listening to 10 candidates boring them to death, I certainly didn't bore them. And then they said, you know, what are you going to do about the cows? I said, well, I'm certainly not going to come back from Brussels to milk them. You know, they were trying to trip you up and give you stupid questions, and so I performed well, got the 4th place, and by a miracle in 1999 was elected. So I almost got to Europe by mistake, really, because I was expecting to then go on to Parliament in 2001 on the list, go all round the Southwest, so look out for seats that I could win in 2001.
Had the cows gone, or did the cows then go?
The cows actually went about 4 or 5 months before the European elections, which was very dangerous because I had no idea that I was going to win. In fact, I didn't think I was going to until the very last minute, because I remember sitting up in bed in the morning, Sunday morning, because you vote on a Thursday, but because Europe doesn't vote, a lot of them on the Sunday, you wait till Sunday for the result.
Right.
And I'd looked at who had voted and where they'd voted, and it looked like the Tory vote had come out and the rest had stayed at home, you see. And I did say to my wife, I said, you do realise there is a chance we might get elected tonight? And she looked rather shocked. And sure enough, I was elected. But I really enjoyed it.
I bet.
And then landed up chairing an agriculture committee with 27 countries. You know, you imagine pleasing farmers, and you imagine pleasing farmers from 27 countries. You know, I mean, it's an impossibility. But it was a great challenge, and it gave me a wider perspective of life. You know, I'd been on my farm in Somerset.
Absolutely.
You know, I learned a lot about the Austro-Hungarian Empire and all the history of Europe, which I'd never learned at school because we did the Romans to death, didn't we? And then we did the Tudors and 1066 and First and Second World War. Really, that was it. You know, so I enjoyed that, and then came back to Westminster in 2010.
and then obviously finished there back home to the family farm.
That's right. So then chaired that, went on the Environment, Food, Rural Affairs Select Committee in 10, stayed there to 15, chaired it in 15 to 22, and then left in a hurry when I was watching something I shouldn't have been doing, and the rest is history, as they say.
And so, let's start with Europe then, because so a little bit about your farm. Should say still actively farm. So what have you got at home now as it stands?
We've got 50 beef cattle.
Yep.
And I'm just rearing 20 calves at the moment. So I haven't been doing calves with milk for 30 years, I expect, and so I've got these sort of things now with the teats on. The last time I was rearing calves, you were putting your fingers under their noses, getting them to suck out of the bucket.
Yeah, especially beef calves.
They get hold of this thing and give it hell, when they're sucking. But they are amazing, actually. And so, I got 10 British Blues, because they were Belgian Blues, but we breed them over here. They become British Blues.
Well,
which is
I'm told Neil
yeah.
can probably answer this question. But there is a slight difference in them, isn't there, between the British Blue and the Belgian Blue?
Well, it's actually, I love the story because you know where they came from, where the blue came from that the Belgians bought from England.
Right, originally.
It was a shorthorn out of a Friesian.
Yeah, that's right. I did read that was where there was. You could see a bit of shorthorn in them.
You can, can't you? That roan that you get, you actually see quite often. Yeah. And I always say there's the shorthorn coming through because that's what we grew up with.
They are an ideal cross with a Friesian because you see the Friesian and especially the Holstein has got rather bony.
Yeah.
Good for milk, but not so good for beef.
Exactly.
Not so dual purpose. Because I used to go the sort of New Zealand line of cows and tried to keep more Friesian when I was breeding. But and so the Belgian Blue, or the British Blue is almost obscene, really, isn't it, with its meat on it?
Yeah.
That's right.
But of course, when crossed with a dairy cow, it's a good cross.
It's a good cross.
I've had a few, and I found them very, very docile. And so
unlike a limmy.
That's right. I've had 2 or 3 of those and haven't been able to catch them. So
that's right.
I thought, well, I don't think I'll keep. As I'm getting older and I got a bad hip, they look at me and think, well, I can run faster than he can anyway. So and they can.
Yes.
And so they largely do. And so I think you want to have something reasonably docile. I've had Devons as well, and I like Herefords, and I like the native breeds, but.
Yep.
I think off of a Friesian job to get a lot of calves at the moment off the suckler herds because they're getting smaller all the time and they get very dear.
Less people are into sucklers because it's not the money in it compared to rearing or taking an integrated, someone like Blade or Butalar or that kind of system. Or dairy cows. Yeah, the suckler herds just aren't there.
No, we get beef from the dairies.
I got the beef. And I enjoy them, and I enjoy livestock. And then I've got about 60 acres of arable, which is wheat and beans, heavy ground. So I didn't think I was going to get any of the corn in this autumn when it got so wet at the middle of October, and then we've had a nice spell.
Suddenly had a dry.
So it's gone in quite well.
Yeah.
I just hope we don't get sort of monsoons again.
I'm guessing you were probably flooded here last winter.
Well, we were splashed over. We don't flood here, but we. And the trouble is, some of the corn, if you get it in well, there's a saying here: "Plough ground dry, always dry; plough ground wet, always wet." And it was wet when we ploughed it, and it just stayed wet all winter. Yeah, it clogs. You think it's a silty soil.
Yeah.
So it's quite logical, really. When it's dry, it's open, and you've got the cracks in it, and it drains. As soon as it gets wet, it gets all like a cheese, really. And of course, it won't go through the cheese.
Right.
So we're up to date where you are on the farming. I guess let's then talk a little bit more about the politics. We don't want to get too political with what's going on at the moment.
Yeah, it's very difficult to tell a politician not to be political. I'll do my best.
Well, I will say this is being recorded the day before the march up in London.
And I shall be there, so I can have my politics tomorrow.
Well, I was
excellent.
planning to be myself, but having been told a week ago I potentially got a fractured ankle, I think it's probably not the best thing. But we'll see on that one. But anyway, so Europe, most people, or whether you could say maybe it's just Brexit, the people that wanted out, because you famously said you were a Remainer.
Yeah.
considered Europe to be a bit of a gravy train. I mean, what was your experience of being in the European Parliament? I suppose, as you say, working with 27 different countries or 26 other different countries.
Especially in agriculture.
Yeah, in agriculture. And let's be honest, unless things have changed a lot, our agriculture is a lot bigger than most other European countries from what I remember from when I was back at college and seen since. How did you find Europe? Was it a bit like, woo, or I suppose, did you first walk in and go, what have I done? Or how did you progress to be chair of the committee you were chair? Some stories from Europe.
Yeah, I mean, when I got there, I remember one of the ITV West Country had me going up and down the escalators to Bologna, and they had me sort of sitting on a bale here at the farm, and then the next minute going up and down these escalators to Strasbourg. And so it was a shock to the system. But, I'm a very adaptable person, and I adapted very quickly. And I also could see that, for better or for worse at that time, the Common Agricultural Policy was important to farming.
Yep.
And I got to understand it. And I got to... The French were not impressed when I became chairman of the Agriculture Committee in 2007. But I actually got an okay with the French. And I used to wind up the French farmers because they're interesting. They get more support from their government, but the governments like to control them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Much more than our government would.
Right.
And so I used to say to the French farmers, you want to be more independent. And he used to wind up Michel Barnier, who was the agriculture minister at the time. So, and he was very funny because we used to negotiate. You see, we were reforming the agriculture policy, and I was the chair, and he was the minister of the presidency. Every 6 months,
yes, it rotated round. So that's right. Yeah,
Barnier was the president. You see, so he didn't like to do detail, you see. So I would ring up and I say to the French officials, I need a meeting with Michel Barnier, and they say yes, Mr. Parish, you can have it, but there's no detail. And I said, no, that'll be fine. And so as soon as I got him in the room, I used to give him hell, and he was very funny because he would say, right. I mean, my French wasn't good enough to negotiate in French, but his English is quite good, even though a very heavy accent. But he won't. What he does, you see, he gives himself time. So I can speak to him in English, and he'll accept all of that, and then he'll speak back to me in French, and it's interpreted for me. So it gives him time to think.
Yeah, very clever.
But you see, when the interpreter gets it wrong, he'll turn around and say, "I didn't say that." I said this, that, and the other in absolutely perfect English. So the whole thing could go on in English. So it was really quite fascinating, and so. And naturally the French always wanted more support. I was much more free market, even though I was in the European Parliament. So it was quite challenging times.
Well, I mean, how did you find the Common Agriculture Policy? Because I don't know.
Very prescriptive.
I was going to say, it's because when we joined, I mean, I was born when we joined Europe. Was that 73? Wasn't it? So I wasn't even around. But I mean, let's be honest, you look at locally, just taking as an example, a lot of orchards got ripped out because they didn't work under Europe.
No.
And now orchards have been coming back in over the last, decade, possibly even longer.
That's right.
I mean, what's your take on the good, the bad, the indifferent of the Common Agricultural Policy?
Yeah, funnily enough, we got a friend that lives in Bratislava in Slovakia, and so we went to see him and his family the other day, back in September, and we got on a train and went to Vienna, and I was watching, it was all maize, from, and they actually combine their maize, they leave it to dry and they take the grain. And in monoculture.
Yes.
And that is the trouble. It had many plus sides, the basic farm payment, but it also had the minus side where a lot of Central and Eastern Europe was nearly all maize.
Right.
And while some of the farms, as you quite rightly say, were quite small, and like in Poland, where a lot of the land the communists actually gave to the peasants, basically, and so therefore there were small farms. But if you take like the Czech Republic and Hungary and others, you'll find that they were big state farms. And so these were then privatised, you see.
My knowledge in that regard would go back to when it was still only 12 in Europe. So.
That's right. And so see, they became massive, 10,000, 20,000 acre farms. And of course, some of the privatisation in the early days of the breakup of communism was interesting.
Well, saying, and that isn't very good environmentally, which we will move on to. But,
that's right.
But so is it like all these things? There's winners and losers, isn't there? Basically.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I voted Remain was that there was a policy, whether you liked it or not, designed to support farmers, which Europe is very good at.
Yeah.
But probably it's just too much and too conservative, basically.
I was going to say, I would say a lot of farmers I knew were actually Brexit because they wanted, what's the word? The opportunities to do things themselves on an equal playing field. And whereas the Common Agricultural Policy didn't allow that.
No. I mean, I think they thought, they were told by the Brexit side that there'll be sort of no regulations and there'll be nothing when they leave, and that hasn't worked out.
That confused me when they were telling me.
The actual policies, I think, are better, provided, that we keep going on them.
I was going to say, they're still that
about
good.
producing food as well. And I think the trouble with a lot of the policies now, the unintentional consequences of them, some of the environmental policies, is a big reduction in the amount of food.
Well, to be honest, I mean, I was going to say there's a couple of things, like you're saying, even though we're out of Europe, we've got to follow European law effectively. And I'll say, I might have said this story before, I can't remember, but when I was in Oz and we were using cedars for, anestrus cows, etc., we used to use estradiol, so synthetic estrogen. But then came when I got to Victoria that all of a sudden we couldn't use estradiol because Europe had banned estradiol. Therefore, we weren't allowed to use estradiol because in Australia they wanted to export their cheese, whatever it happened to be, into Europe. Therefore, we had to follow European regulations. So it's not like this is new. This is following what's already happened before. And then you just said something else. Yes, I've said this to a few of my clients that are younger with what's been going on at the moment. You'd remember this. It's almost like we've gone back to the mid-90s where you can make more money environmentally, in that case, set aside than what you can actually farm. And we've gone that circle again. It's tipped too far the wrong way again at the moment. We need that balance back again. Yes, we need to be doing things environmentally that are beneficial, but we also need to produce food.
I mean, £670 a hectare to grow wildflowers. Now, I think wildflowers are lovely, and a few percentage of your farm into wildflowers is great. They have changed the policy, but I mean, there were some farms that went entirely. I mean, if you were about to retire and you had nobody to take on, wouldn't you grow a lot of wildflowers?
Perfect idea.
I mean, you're going to have a job to net whatever you do, £670 a hectare.
Well, I mean, I've heard stories of estates that pulled farms back in hand and simply put them into environmental.
And to trees and others. And now, you've got to remember also, tree planting is good, but if we were to plant trees across the whole of this country and then import our food from Brazil, you've got to remember that when the tree is cut down in the rainforest, it holds 3 times as much carbon as ours by the very nature of the climate, the amount of rain, the amount of heat. So those trees grow much more rapidly. And so it's a real nonsense, really, that we don't actually
peatlands are better than the trees.
Well, we did a podcast on our first year, wasn't it, with Sarah Bolt, who's obviously now a co-host, but it was called, what was it? I can't remember, but basically saying trees aren't the answer. It's not just trees, wasn't it? I think it's not just trees.
That's right.
And we talked about carbon sequestration, and she'd done some work on soils and the advantages of the different soils. And as you say, a lot of people seem to think, we'll just stick trees, that's the answer. But it's not.
No. See, bands of trees in areas where you want to perhaps stop the soil eroding, all sorts of things can be, tree planting can be used to great advantage.
Yes.
But it's got to be planned. And there's a lot of number of farms in Devon that I know that have been, really good land that's been taken back by the landlord, as you say, and put into trees. And it really has a downside for tenant farming, which I don't think the previous government ever really intended.
No, I mean, you could say as well, on another extreme, I'm very aware myself, I think it was some land that we used to farm as a kid, that's now been brought by somebody and they've decided to rewild it. Okay, fine, if that's what you want to do, but they've decided to rewild it without a plan. They've just let it go. And that's the wrong thing to do. If you're going to rewild it, have a plan, not have just let it go to brambles and whatever it happens to be. You've got to plan and think about the thing. It's not just that'll do the job.
Yeah, because you see, with my podcast, we can do both. I did an interview with Ben Goldsmith, but he's rewilding, but he's having a real plan, and he's also on very marginal land there in North Somerset, and so. You see, if we choose our land carefully, then we can still produce quite a lot of food, because we can rewild sensibly the land that is very difficult to produce, sort of certainly crops.
Well, I was going to say, we will get onto your podcast, definitely, because that's what first got us talking, wasn't it? Because I do listen to that. It's one of the few I listen to regularly, I must admit.
Well, I'm glad somebody listens.
Well, I know people say to me, what podcast do you listen to? And it's like, well, considering I do them, I don't really listen to them.
No.
But it was, I think it was him or someone, one of your ones, was it something, I can't remember the exact figure, was it something like 80% of the farm is on 20% of the land, or it was something like that, isn't it? I didn't realise.
Production, yes. There's 80% of the production is something like 20% of the land, and of course a lot of it's in the eastern counties, and a lot around Lincolnshire and so on, and certainly a lot of the vegetable production. But of course, what we do also have on the west side of the country is very good livestock production.
Exactly.
And you see, you've got to remember that
and what that adds to the soil
actually holds as much carbon as up to 20 years for tree planting.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And people forget that.
That's something we tried to learn, or what we did learn and hoped other people did when we did that one with Sarah.
You need the livestock in order to graze the grass, and humans haven't yet grazed grass.
No.
And so it's really, keen I am to remember that, good. Most of my beef production, you see, is on grass. And I took 4 animals to market, 2 Hereford heifers and 2 Devons. Well, they'd been fattened entirely on grass. And so one is cost effective, and 2, it's permanent pasture. So I'm not only producing good beef, all being well, but keeping the carbon in the soil.
Livestock are part of the answer. They're part of the solution.
Yes, exactly. They're not the enemy.
No.
And I think a lot of sensible environmentalists actually see that. But you have, dare I say it, some of the headbangers who...
There's always fundamentalists
I won't
or
say
whatever
who
you
the
do.
headbangers are, so you'll be able to get away with that. But it's a case, really, you've got to... life is a compromise. And I think, we can actually do more for our environment, and we can still produce very good food. But we got to do it carefully. You see some of the best land being taken for solar panels and the like.
Yes.
You see all of that. That should not be happening.
No.
Ed Miliband, I mean...
Oh, I read a thing about Ed Miliband on social media this weekend. Isn't it something, since he's come into government, and how long they've been back in government, 3 months or something, he's done something like 25 or 26,000 miles in a plane, and moaning about us and our carbon. I'm sorry, Ed, but...
That's right. Yes, hypocrisy. Dare I say it, this government, does have a little hypocrisy, as do all governments.
Well, I'm glad you added it, as do all governments.
Yeah.
I could say so.
Be reasonably fair, so
Yes.
I'll try and be reasonably fair. Yeah.
But I mean, so Europe, any more stories from Europe that you think are worth sharing before we move on to Westminster?
One of the really fascinating stories about Europe was I was chairing the Agriculture Committee, and the Irish Farmers Association, which are sort of an NFU, really, National Farmers Union, but very strong in the Republic. They had been to Brazil, and they'd followed some cattle into the slaughterhouse and found they had no ear tags.
Right.
And so they brought this evidence to the Agriculture Committee. I got the European Commission to ban Brazilian beef for a while.
Excellent.
And of course, I was I don't think any Englishman has ever been treated better than in Dublin. And so they lauded me, I was remembering going, and I said, well, of course, my grandmother was Miss O'Reilly, you see.
Yeah.
And, we'll find your relatives. I said, I'm not sure I'm going to find them just yet. But I had a great time. But it was, and then I took the Agriculture Committee over to Brazil, and we were we were in this meeting in the Senate, and they were just sort of calling us imperialists and colonialists, and they ranted and raved for about 2 hours. And the poor interpreter, she eventually said, she eventually said, I've really had enough. I said, I don't worry, I've largely got the message.
Got the gist of it.
And some of the senators left, you see, and when I had to write a reply, I called them all back in before I blasted back, because one thing, I don't declare war, but politically, but when war's declared on me, I fight it, and I'm a bit like Montgomery, all the ammunition is piled up and then I fire it before I move, and so I fired back at these.
Oh, wow.
And, because you see, and the one final thing about this was very funny. You see, you right, the Europeans are coming. We got this massive slaughterhouse. They're going to visit around not far from São Paulo in southern Brazil. So here we arrive, you see, and all up through the huge race up into the slaughterhouse, all tagged perfectly. And there was a huge gantry along the top, you see. And so, of course, being farming background, I thought, right. I said, well, we'll get up there and walk along, you see.
Yeah.
Their heart, I could see their faces drop. And of course, sure enough, when we got in the middle of this
so the ones you could see were tagged, and all the ones you couldn't.
But once we got up on the gantry, went right through, and there was, pen after pen. Like there must have been 5,000 cattle. And right in the middle, there were half a dozen or a dozen pens without any tags.
Yeah.
And you see, so I sent through the interpreter. I said, well, how do you know where they've come from? And they said, we asked the lorry driver. So you see, but why on earth? On the day that the Europeans are arriving, did they not say there will not be an animal in there that's not tagged?
Yeah.
And it shows, you say, these don't land up in Europe. I said, well, how do we know?
Yeah.
There's a big slaughterhouse. How do you know
once
they come through? And of course, the argument we were having with them is that they may have even been for Bolivia or anywhere else, and they may have had foot and mouth disease, you see. So but like I said, that was really a fascinating time, and I shall live with that the whole of my life, because it was
experiences you otherwise would have had, would you?
No, that's right.
I mean, so then moving on, you ended up in Westminster. You were Honiton and
Tiverton and
Honiton.
Yeah,
that's right. So, how did you find Westminster in comparison to Europe, or what? Having done both, how do they compare? Is one better than the other in certain ways, or is it all just the usual snouts in the trough?
Well.
Sorry, I'm not cynical.
Yeah, exactly. Funny enough, you see, and I never said this to my parliamentary colleagues, because they would have had me sort of hung, drawn, and quartered, had I, and my head probably put on a spike outside Parliament. But you see, European Parliament was actually better organised than Westminster, because you see, you need interpreters. The whole thing's got to be organised, and so you see, you're basically Westminster works on the government. There's no government in Europe, nor should be, not in the European Parliament. So therefore, we are sort of it's a huge lobbying exercise, really, but with a sort of structure to it. Whereas Parliament, you see, is got the government, and the government's putting its business through, and it's up to the opposition to oppose it.
Yep.
Because all of a sudden, if the opposition decide not to oppose it, the three-line whip, which is, the three-line whip is when you've got to be there to vote.
Yes.
That slips, and everybody goes. And I've never seen, the rats, leave the sinking ship so fast. And it just sort of amazed me to start with. And after a while, I got absolutely used to it.
Yeah.
And even if they had meetings and things, they were all abandoned, and they went. And it was a very odd place. And I found it more formal and more difficult to start with, because the European Parliament, I'd been sort of a councillor, and I'd been a leader of a council, and so I'm very used to getting a group of people together. So we had about 35 Conservatives in the European Parliament, and then we were in a bigger group. So in a way, that was very similar to what I dealt with on the council. Even the issues were different, but the politics of the actual idea of the groups and how you worked your political side was very similar. And then in Westminster, it's totally different. And of course, I was brought up a Methodist. I'm a non-conformist.
Would you say
I didn't like the very strict whipping? Really.
Right. Would
you say some of it is, though, because like you said, it was more, Westminster's more formal. Would you say that's because there's more history, tradition in Westminster than what there is in Europe?
I mean, what was absolutely much better about Westminster was the debates, and you couldn't intervene in the European Parliament, and only occasionally when the Brits used to have a go at each other, we would set the European Parliament on fire because we were very good debaters, whereas a lot of the Europeans aren't. They just read statements into a sort of a form of Hansard, whereas I believe in Westminster you debate properly, and if I was on form and I was in the chamber, they would try to get me on any agricultural matters, as you could imagine. I could fire back, and I used to love them to come at me, and I would let them intervene, and then I would shoot them, and only metaphorically, and so they don't allow us to carry swords anymore, so it's very politically correct.
It would be much easier.
But then that probably a lot of people don't realise, or maybe they don't. That's what that red line is, isn't it? It's supposed to be two sword widths.
Yes, so they couldn't draw their sword and stick them at each other. And one or two of them MPs in the cloakroom used to sort of hang toy swords, but it was the debating was much better. The organisation, like I said, quite chaotic, but it works. I suppose, what was it, Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government barring all others. And it has its purpose, really. And you do have a proper debate. You see, funny enough, the Brits were much ruder to each other in debate. But the Europeans are very polite to one another, but the different parties, but they don't get on. Whereas you see, we're very rude to each other in the chamber, but a lot of us, I probably preferred some of the opposition that I did my own side.
To go to the bar or whatever.
Yeah.
But then that surely's got to be a good thing in some ways, because if you're at the bar, I'm sure there's plenty of work and negotiation happens there.
Yeah, part of it also works a bit like the old court of the kings. It's gossip and it's knowledge, because I'd sort of been doing quite a bit of whipping over my time in the European Parliament and in the Council, I always sort of used to watch, and you could see that there'd be groups of people on tables, and you knew when the plots were around because immediately they were sitting down together. And I thought, they're up to date, good because you would know the individual. But I was only there a couple of years when somebody sidled up and he said, we need to get rid of David Cameron. And I said, well, not yet, I don't think. And just sort of kept moving. But there were always plots.
Right.
And it's amazing.
Amazing, must be.
Yeah, and then, of course, the last few years, we did nothing but destroy us.
Well, I know. I mean, my children are 6 and 9, and they're like going... They're trying to, the oldest one tries to list all the prime ministers that he's had in his time. And I'm going, well, at the time I was your age, I think we would have had James Callaghan, Maggie Thatcher, and that was it. And he's going, well, I've had... and he's trying to remember them all, given how we've just chopped and changed.
He does. He has a real problem, doesn't he? Because, we went through them at a rate of knots, didn't we?
Yeah, definitely.
So Liz Truss lasted 46 days.
Yeah.
And I was up in London in GB News when they were sort of throwing the lettuce around. Remember that?
That's right.
The iceberg lettuce that lasted
longer than Liz Truss. Yeah. But I mean,
very clever.
So your time in Westminster, I suppose, how do you not play the system? How do you progress in the system? Because what I understand, it seems to be either you go as a minister or you go as a backbencher and do the different bits. Yeah. You obviously chose to go, I'm guessing, backbench.
I was what's called a senior backbencher. I was a scrutineer of government. You get paid extra salary. You don't get paid as much as a minister, but you get half as much. And so you are, I was the one to come to on farming and the environment, really. Yep. And so, and I built up a very good reputation in that way. And I was very tough on the ministers if they wouldn't ask the questions. Because they'd come in and they'd say, there is no problem. I said, you wouldn't be here if there was a problem. And I would keep at them until I got some sort of... I got on very well personally with George Eustace, but I remember interviewing him, about the trade deals, you see, and I knew he wasn't happy with them, you see, because we didn't put, New Zealand, Australia, great countries, but, there should have been a few more restrictions than there were. But anyway, so, and he'd say, well, of course, it's cabinet collective responsibility, you see, and I say, Secretary of State, I want to know what
There's a politician for you.
Exactly, you see, because I knew privately what his position was, but of course, we got on extremely well. So And I used to be able to negotiate quite a lot of things behind the scenes. So I didn't want to sort of blow the gaff and say, well, I know you don't like this anyway. You told me so. I couldn't quite go that far. And I did tease him when he left the Secretary of State's job, and he did say that he was upset about these trade deals. I said, well, at least you came clean eventually, George. I really did enjoy, probably almost too much, really, the sort of really holding the government to account and getting them to try and enact policy. I mean, I would bring experts in. And
that's your job, though. Surely as an MP, even if it's your own party, you are representing the people you are representing, so Tiverton and Honiton, and it's to hold the government to doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I mean, and in the farming community too, I was, I had my supporters, there was no doubt, because I would stand up, and I would get the meat processors in. I got them in over the pork situation when they weren't paying a fair price. I used to say that they used to bring them into the daylight. A lot of those processors needed to be brought into the daylight.
Were you there with the horse meat scandal?
Yeah, I was, and I remember I wasn't chairing there, but I got some questions in, and the Irish were there, you see, and I said, there seems to be about 11 or 12,000 horses that have gone missing. Where are they? And, we don't know, Mr. Ragg. We have no idea. Lying toe rags. You know exactly where they are. And, of course, after that, there was a lot of frozen sort of beef, wasn't it, that the slaughter industry reckons was horse anyway. I mean, there was nothing wrong with horse, but, if...
It's the fact that it says on the label.
I can say, if you're going to, if you expect to get beef, I remember they were interviewing a lady from Dublin, and she said, well, you're only paying €1 for 4 burgers, you ought to question what's in them. And I thought she's absolutely right. We had a lot of the meat people in, and we knew what they were up to. But of course, in the end, we sort of tightened up a bit on that, but it's where there. I better not say that on the podcast, but there are interesting people sometimes.
Lots of mascarpone was sold.
Well, before we move on then to talk about your podcast, are there any other stories from Westminster you are willing or able to share that people might enjoy?
One of the ones which is actually not about DEFRA was when I was, for a short while, I was a PPS, which is personal private secretary, really, which is a very grand title for a bag carrier, really, to John Hayes, who was the Minister of Transport. He was very nice, John Hayes. And so him and I were actually very similar because we talked too much and we were late. And so we were very, very bad influence on each other. But anyway, I was in a meeting with the Secretary of State, for Transport, Patrick McLaughlin. I didn't get on terribly well with Patrick. And so we were talking about an amendment on cycling, you see, and Patrick, we don't want that, blah, blah, blah. Well, I used to do quite a bit of cycling in London, you see, and I said, I don't know why, I think it would be quite popular, you see, and I was sort of put back in my box, shouldn't be saying anything. And so I knew that John Hayes went into David Cameron and helped him prepare for PMQs. So so I said on a Wednesday. So I said to John, I said, when you go in to do that, mention this cycling amendment to the Prime Minister. You see, to David Cameron. Well, he does, and of course the Prime Minister said, "Well, I'm very in favour of this amendment." Well, of course, all of a sudden, it was impossible. The amendment just sailed through that night, and nobody in this world knows what Neil Parish did about that amendment. But like I said, I was so amused because 1 minute it was sort of absolutely impossible to do.
Then
the Prime Minister, and another time we were talking about elephants in circuses, and Cameron actually wasn't in favour of getting rid of these elephants. There's only about 1 or 2 left in the country in circuses, and so we were talking, and it was all going through very well with the then Secretary of State at the time. And all of a sudden, the lady from the Cabinet Office says, the Prime Minister is not happy with this. Well, it's like you sort of tipped a bucket of cold water over the whole lot. It just sort of disappeared off the face of the earth. And so, the internal workings of government were quite fascinating.
Is there a particular Prime Minister you enjoyed more than others, or working under, or is that not an appropriate question?
I mean, I probably
given that we've had so many in recent times.
I enjoyed. I thought David Cameron was a good Prime Minister. I wasn't particularly close to him, but probably was the best Prime Minister in my time. Mm-hmm. For me, William Hague was the best Prime Minister we never had.
Yeah,
and for me, he would have been my choice, really.
I was out the country. I mean, I emigrated not long after Blair came in. So it was 98. I eventually left, but you could see Hague was on what's the term I'm looking for? Well, he was never going to win. He was. No. They were he was the best man for the job, but he was never going to win because they were so far behind. And by the time they got in a position to be back in power, he'd lost his opportunity.
That's right. You see, the trouble is we behead our leaders when they don't perform, they don't win the election. Well, it wasn't.
Did he stand for? What did he do? 1 or 2 elections?
No, he won. You see,
but he was never. He was never going to get back.
To 2000, they're never going to win it.
No,
and so because Blair, the economy had turned. We'd more or less turned the economy before he got into power, and then things can only get better.
Oh, don't say that. I hate that song now.
And they did for a while until Gordon Brown. Remember he said we can't have I've done away with the boom and bust of Tories, and of course he just got a bigger boom and a bigger bust. But poor boy, it came back to bite him just when he became Prime Minister, which Blair had all the good years, and Brown picked up the SH1T, so it was quite fascinating. But you're right. I mean, I think Prime Ministers come and go. Theresa May would have been a good Prime Minister in peacetime, but was just not prepared to do Brexit. Boris got Brexit done, and then I was going to say something rude then. I just messed the whole thing up afterwards, really.
Didn't
shame that he just should have been just much more truthful. If he'd come and said, I'm sorry about the parties, I was sort of suffering from COVID, I'd come back, blah, blah, blah. Admitted them, and everybody would have gone up the wall, but he would have survived. But, of course, the trouble is Boris does like to sort of spin, and, of course, once you start spinning, I very much like Boris, but I would go into him and say, we've got to do something about these trade deals, we need to support farming and look after farmers. Neil, because I knew Boris well. We'll always look after farmers, but he didn't. No. And you see, he'd be better off saying to me, it's very difficult, Neil, but I'll do what I can. And I would have argued with him because you could with Boris.
But Boris seems to come across to me as that person always wants to tell you yes.
Yeah.
But actually,
he wants to please you.
Yes.
At that moment. But the trouble is, you see, when you're Prime Minister, you have to stand firm, and so much better to say, I will, see what I can do, but that policy, on the trade deal is I don't want any restrictions. Now, he should have had the courage to say that. I would have disagreed with him, but it was a position that I was expecting him to take, if you see what I mean. But he didn't, you see. He took completely the contrary with me. Then I would talk to the free traders, and they say, you're going to put it in there. And of course, because we used to talk to each other, even though we disagreed on the principle of some of these things. And so, and see, as Prime Minister, again, it is like the court. Everybody knows when the Prime Minister has said something different to what he's said to you. Yes. And so you're not going to get away with it.
No.
And that was the biggest problem.
I hear what you're saying. You actually almost need to be allowed to argue and to debate it. And if somebody just says, okay, and you don't debate it, and then it goes another direction.
That's right. Because I would have, if nobody'd ever put me into Prime Minister, but, had I been, I would have been quite firm on things because, and say to people, this is what we're going to do. You could be reasonable, but you've got to have a line and stick to it.
That's right. Draw this line in the sand.
Whether the only trouble with this particular government is they got the wrong lines and they're still sticking to it. Inheritance tax and everything else. So, and I'm going to London to set fire to Parliament. But Guy Fawkes tried that. He didn't quite succeed.
I will mention that I wasn't going to. Even my other half, who's not a farming background at all, has gets it very quickly that £1 million these days is nothing. I mean, to be honest with you, the farmhouse I grew up in is probably worth £1 million now. And okay, you might say it's a bit of a fancy farmhouse, but it's nothing. And even she gets really, by the time you buy a house, it's probably 30, 40 acres. And that's it. That's not a viable farm.
No, you see, 100 acres is 10,000 an acre is £1 million. Now you can't farm on 100 acres. No. Then you've got your house. Your tractors. Your machinery. And you see, they're only returning probably between £5,000 and £10,000 a return on £1 million. And so how can you be asked to raise £200,000 on £1 million, every other million?
Exactly. But that's still ongoing. And as you say, as we record this, the protest is tomorrow up in London.
Interesting to see whether, because I think that, you see, the Dysons of this world have made it, are always going to make it difficult and I could see this coming because they were taking advantage, really, of the situation.
I read the other day, they think he's farming about 36,000 acres.
Yeah, and see, wow. There's no way, really, he should have agricultural relief on all of that, you see. So, but to set the limit at $1 million, and then, of course, say very disingenuously, oh, well, of course, those are in partnership, it'll be $2 million. But see, they've got to be full partners.
Yeah.
And so, this is how the figures, you see, they've skewed the figures.
And it's only going to affect, was it 500 farms, whatever it is? It's not going to do it. But anyway,
But it's just, I just feel sorry for family farms who, they work hard, they very often borrowed a lot of money, and they just, it's just another thing for them to worry about, really.
Definitely. Absolutely.
And it's just politics for the sake of it, and I don't like that.
No.
So let's move on ourselves, talk about podcasting, because obviously you now do a podcast called We Can Do Both, which has been, 6-8 months you've been doing that?
Yeah, I started on the 29th of February, as it was a leap year.
So
Fantastic.
What got you into doing that? Because, I'll admit I listen to every episode now. I haven't listened to your current one, but I know there's a couple in there. I particularly like the one you did with Ben Goldsmith and the one you did about the salt marshes, was it here in Hinckley Sea? But, and there's some really good stuff in there that you're going, oh, I didn't know that. And obviously the slant is we can do both, as we can farm and we can do the environment, or that's my understanding of it. But what got you into it? What made you decide to do it? Yeah, what's your take on it?
I've always had, I'm a strange politician, you see, because I spent my whole life concentrating on agriculture and the environment, either in the European Parliament or in Westminster. And so it's just a continuation, really. And I thought, what can I now do? And so, and I enjoy meeting different people, and I enjoy doing the interviewing. As I said at the beginning, I like the sound of my own voice. And so and I tried to do it reasonably in a light-hearted way, at serious points, but in a light-hearted way. Get a few jokes in, because, I've always been... The one thing I've said, and I will not bore people to death, and whether they agree with me or not, I will not bore them to death. And so, and I think podcasting is about keeping it interesting, keeping it slightly light, really, and then then hit people between the eyes in between.
You say that, we said not too much, but have you seen the reports that they say that it's what won Trump the election was podcasts?
May well be. Because of course, the trouble with Trump is that it's not always true either.
But, that's the
only thing that's true, then it might not be true.
If he doesn't like it, he said, well, that's fake news. The fact that he's probably putting out fake news is another matter. But be careful, he is President of the United States. I'll probably have the FBI here.
That's right, so we'll soon be sorted.
Certainly the report I read said he ignored mainstream media, so CNN, ABC, whatever. He went for podcasting, so the likes of Joe Rogan had millions of views, and they had, was it a 20 to 25% increase in young males turn up to vote, which was not taken account for in the polls, and they reckon that's what won him. Now, how true that is, I don't know. As you say, it's Trump, and as someone said, 4 years ago, he was like, well, they were cheating. No, I didn't get back in because they were cheating. So why aren't they cheating this time to keep you out again?
That's right, yes, exactly. I mean, that was very, very wrong. And, of course, what got me cross was, I think, some of those guys that, there was that guy walking down the road in Washington, one of the statues. He'd stolen out of the, but he got 17 years. And Trump got nothing. And he was the one excited them to get there. I mean, I thought that was very excessive because yes, they shouldn't have stormed Washington, but because and see, Trump took about an extra hour to call out the National Guard, didn't he?
Yeah.
So I mean, the whole thing was amazing. You know, what I mean, but American politics is extreme. And people take two views, and of course, the women's vote was probably going more to the Democrats, but not enough.
Yep.
And what I do, you see, I don't necessarily like his America First policies, but of course, as a slogan, it's brilliant.
Of course it is.
America
Of course it is at the moment,
Like
especially.
the Brexit campaign, give us back our country.
That's right.
I mean, I had to argue about a single market and a customs union and a God knows what I could have done with a slogan like
like
"Give
that.
us back our
Absolutely.
country."
So
and that's what Trump did.
So bringing it back to the podcast, I mean, is it literally plan is at the moment go ongoing?
Yeah,
See
I mean,
where it goes?
I sort of do it. Sort of, I've got several other interviews I've done, and I sort of go from one to another, and then I'm a sort of very much an opportunist, really.
Yes.
And if I see an issue, and I think there's going to be a bit about inheritance tax in a minute. I feel that one coming on.
Yeah, I bet.
And
That's going to be one.
That will affect the amount of food we're going to produce in the end. Seriously. So the issues come, don't they?
Yes.
And the guy that I've got producing it actually tries to sort of keep me out of the political arena, and of course being a politician, I go back into it. That's the trouble. But he's very good. Jake, who does it for me, is excellent. But he's always a bit worried that I'm going to get sort of too political. But we try not to.
Well, to be honest, I mean, that's how this all came about, is I obviously stumbled probably on social media that we can do both, heard a couple, and it was like, oh, do you fancy coming on this one and just something a little bit different and talking as we've done, talking about farming, talking about politics and talking about podcasting?
Well, I really enjoyed the interview, as you can probably tell. I hope that you haven't got to edit out too much.
No.
And, because I think, if we could make it entertaining, but also, make it funny, but also give people something to think about.
Exactly.
And I think while they're being amused, they're also... See, when I made a speech, you always got to start off with a joke and finish with a joke. It doesn't matter what you say in the middle; they've largely forgotten. But you've got to hit them between the eyes at the beginning and get them to listen.
Yeah.
And then you've got to hit them between the eyes at the end. I got to do the 90 years of Bridgewater young farmers on Saturday, so I'm just thinking about what I got to say and make up as I go along. I suspect.
Well, to be honest, we've always said that, though, isn't it? This has never been about preaching to people. No. It's been about you're listening into basically a chat down the pub. You just happen to be listening in, or around the kitchen table, and if we can make you think about what you're doing and maybe then go and do it better, that's a win.
Absolutely. And I think I think podcasts give you a chance to have a proper conversation. Yep. And you can go into quite a lot more detail than you would. The trouble with mainstream media, a lot of it is sound bites. Yep. And of course, political interviews, especially if they start a Paxman style, of course, you then to have a Paxman reaction. You then sort of just fight back with sound bites as well, and you don't really debate or learn anything from them. And I think podcasts really, podcasts in the right hands, and you and I and all, we are in the right hands, we would say so, wouldn't we? Because we are doing them. But I think, they can be a little bit dangerous if they're taken to places where, people are trying to manipulate people.
Yes.
And that's, you just got to be a bit careful
because
with that,
exactly.
That's going back to that Trump. That's what made me think there is maybe you could argue the reason he did them is there's no balance to counter him. He could have gone on Joe Rogan. It's not someone I would listen to. But from what I understand, it would play perfectly into Trump's hands and how he wants to portray himself and what he wants to do. He's got no one to balance and argue with him.
That's right.
And counter what he's saying.
You see, because he doesn't really get on in Washington itself, you see. He goes back to sort of his sort of cronies, really, and gets recharged, and he'll do the same now. I mean, he's having a great time at the moment, isn't he, really putting about as many people in as secretaries. Well, they're not secretaries of state, they're secretaries. They call them the Secretary for Agriculture and so on. But he's putting in sort of just people who are going to annoy the establishment like hell. And he's really enjoying enjoying himself. But the only thing is, and I'm not a great Trump supporter, but the only thing you can say, he did say he was going to do it.
Yes.
And it doesn't, whatever people can say, you can't pin him down and say, well, he didn't say he was going to do it.
Some would argue the same about Boris. He said he was going to sort out Brexit, and he did it.
He did, that's right. And he was unconventional, you see. And Trump is most definitely.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the politest thing you can say about him.
Yeah.
But, in some ways, like with Ukraine and others, I mean, he might be the right one because I don't want to see more people killed. I want, and the trouble is now the North Koreans have come in on, Putin's side. I mean, I just think they'll just lose more and more men. And you don't really want Russians to die because it's not Russia that's invading Ukraine, it's Putin.
Exactly. I agree with that.
I know that we were having a conversation back from the rugby. I took my kids to, minis rugby yesterday, and my kids were like, well, have we got to have war? And it was...
Because
how do you answer that?
In the end, I think Putin won't live forever. Now, we don't know who's going to replace Putin. But the thing is, the Ukrainian lives that we saved, if they do sue for peace, they probably will have to give up land. But you see, it's interesting. Today, all of a sudden, Biden has allowed them to fire those missiles into Russia. We should have allowed him to do it straight away and really bring the war to Russia and wake up the Russian people. But it's too late now, but interesting that Biden makes this decision on the way out.
And say, is he doing that deliberately to
up the ante, I imagine. But you see, we've never really the West haven't armed the Ukrainians enough to beat the Russians, and so
I don't think we can.
Them out. And so we're just sort of, it's a war of attrition.
Yeah.
And I rather fear the Russians will win it because of the fact that they've just got limitless resources. And he'll always find people like North Korea and others to buy his oil and gas and so on.
That's right.
Well, I would say we intended this not to be that political, and we've ended up talking far more political than I ever intended. And as I say, the conversation goes where the conversation goes. So I'm not gonna worry about that.
You're the one that led us at the end. So.
The honest answer is, I'll leave it in there because I'd say I usually don't.
I think it's fairly, it's knockabout politics, but it's not particularly British party politics a lot of it. So, and I think, internationally, we are very concerned about all of this. And
it's very relevant to farming.
Yes, it is.
It was the farming crisis. It was the Ukrainian situation that drove up food prices.
Yes,
and of course,
exactly.
That's what this government must look at because family farms produce a lot of food, and it was only 3 or 4 years ago that people were crying out for farms and farm shops, and their memories are short, aren't they?
Because I've got to admit, I remember before he invaded, it was all there, and I used to buy the straights for the raw materials for the buying group that I was looking after at the time, and I remember talking to the buyer, and I was going, no, it's just a load of saber rattling. It's just do you want to do it beforehand? I said, no, it's just saber. I read this piece and it says the Chinese have told him not to go until after the Winter Olympics because they don't want to upset things with the Winter Olympics. They want to look good for the Winter Olympics. Oh, do you want? No, it's just a load of saber rattling. And then when he did it, it was like, oh. I really didn't think he was going to do it. He was just going to saber rattle and just it's the way it went. As you say, it's very relevant because look how the knock-on effect it has had on everything.
Absolutely.
I mean, certainly I remember fertilizer, all of these things have knocked on, and it is very, ultimately, while I've said we tried not to talk about politics or didn't want to, it is all relevant to what we've been talking about. Really. It is all relevant to agriculture. Everything we talk about does have so whether it's Trump in America, it is relevant to agriculture. Whether it's Ukraine, it's all relevant to agriculture. We live in a global world now, whether we like it or not. And I guess we know that. I counted up, did a talk for somebody the other day. We have been listened to in 48 countries with this podcast.
Amazing.
Which is just what, and they're literally every continent.
So I'm going to get visited by the Russians now.
Funny enough, I think it's our current podcast has had its first Russian listen. We've had our first Russian listener on our current podcast.
I'll take cover when they arrive. Yeah.
But
I do have a few shotguns around.
But we are a global world, whether we like it or not. We are relevant. What happens here happens there. Like we've already mentioned, in Australia, we couldn't suddenly use a drug because Europe said we can't use it. They weren't using it. So it is, there's interaction of everything.
I'm liberal when it comes to genetic modification, and I think gene editing, there's a lot of things we can help with much less pests and sprays if we were to use some of the genetically, not
GMOs,
modified altogether, but certainly the geno editing is very much like enhanced plant breeding.
Or animals.
And I think, I'm sorry, the NGOs that stopped the golden rice, I think were totally wrong, because they were denied the developing world of rice that had protein in it. And yes, they've got to have fresh seed, but, I'm a farmer. It's much better to have fresh seed. I think, the world is an interesting place, and I think Britain's going to have to decide in the end. It's interesting, the Americans have said, if a trade deal, you'll have to decide between Europe and America. Now, I think this particular government will probably huff and puff and largely stay on the European side. But a future government more on the right may well consider a deal with America. But we've got to free our farmers up commercially if we went in with America, and you can't. We've got our hands too tied at the moment, so it would be quite catastrophic to keep our hands tied and then do a deal.
The few Americans I've met over the years, and I'm just looking at time, so we will need to pull this to a close. But they cannot believe some of the restrictions that we have.
That's right. Yeah, I've met a few, especially in the dairy.
Just take badgers, for example. I mean, I met a few Americans, and they're like, well, you just shoot them. Nope, not happening. What do you mean?
A lot of the Europeans think the same.
Yeah, it's just an example of what we're saying.
I mean, Americans carry enough guns to shoot. So I won't go and say what I was going to say, but it is fascinating. You take the chlorinated chicken, right? Now, only about 20% of American chicken is actually treated that way. It's the lower end of the chicken market. They've been produced with more diseases and less well. And so they clean them up and make them safe to eat by the chlorine. And of course, that's what they want to send here, really. So they don't need to send that here. It's a fascinating argument, because I remember when Sonny Perdue he came to Westminster, and he was Secretary of Agriculture, and he invited me back to America, and they took me into this room, you see, and they were going to show me how safe the chlorine wash was, you see. And I said, yes, it's nothing wrong with your chlorine wash. I said, it's what's the chicken are like before you wash them.
Yes.
And their faces dropped, because they thought, they were just going to have that. And they were going to provide me with the safety of that.
So I said, looking at the time, it's time we draw this to a close. So,
unfortunately,
Neil, exactly. This has been fantastic time. Thank you. Learned some bits and pieces and some great stories. But any last words of wisdom?
Well, I think just the fact that farming is important, food is important. When they say, if you are hungry, you only have one problem. If you're well fed, you have many problems. And I think, we sometimes forget that in this country.
So true.
And so I think, the morality of the environment is there, but there is a morality in food production as well. And let's not forget that. I'll be very serious at the final point.
No, that is fair comment. And Neil, any comments from you?
No, actually, I fully agree. I mean, we have got to protect our own food.
Yes.
In the UK, that's got to be number one. And I've seen it in Europe, where they're putting huge tax on methane, and it's just sort of, when I look at like Denmark, where in one of them is one example, I just think to myself that the politicians aren't looking at protecting their farmers who are producing food, and that's sad.
And also, you've got to remember that the public in the end have to pay a price for it. And you see, a lot of the production is very, especially, and I've got I think organic farming is great, but, it is more expensive. And it's very middle class. Middle England, if you like, as Tony Blair coined the phrase. But, and you've got to remember there's a lot of people out there struggling. So, we've got to produce food on all sectors, and we've got to produce it for the bulk supply as well as the niche supply.
And protect them.
There's too much sort of concentration on niche supply and not enough on those retailers.
Absolutely.
No, well, I'd like to really say thank you very much for your time, Neil. It's been fantastic to meet you and fantastic to record this with you. So thank you very much, and I wish you well continued with your podcast. We can do both. I'd certainly recommend it to people if they. I enjoy it. just because it's quite an easy listen, as you say, the point's there, and you do learn some nice little bits and pieces in it, definitely. So
I hope so, and thank you, and you're doing a very good podcast, and thank you both for coming to interview me this afternoon. I'll go back and put my old clothes on and carry on and
farming.
More farming.
No. So, as I said, if I forgot to say it earlier, and I won't, it's say as this is our episode before Christmas. Happy Christmas to everybody.
Happy Christmas, everyone.
And hope you have a great time with your family and friends. We look forward to you listening to us again soon. So, otherwise, it's a goodbye from me
and from me.
And goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the Chewing the Cud podcast, a podcast for the UK dairy industry brought to you from the southwest of England and listened to around the world. And now for the really boring bit, I'm afraid, the legal disclaimer. The information provided during this podcast has been prepared for general information purposes only and does not constitute advice. The information must not be relied upon for any purpose, and no representation or warranty is given to its accuracy, completeness, or otherwise. Any reference to other organisations, businesses, or products during the podcast are not endorsements or recommendations of Chewing the Cud Limited. The views of Andrew Jones are personal and may not be the views of Chewing the Cud Limited, and the views of Neil Gregor are personal and may not be the views of Game Changer Farming and any affiliated companies. For more information on the podcast and details of services offered by Chewing the Cud Limited, visit www.chewingthecud.com. Thank you and goodbye.